fiction into fact.
Sometimes kind of real architectural life interferes with intellectual architectural life.
There is no such thing as architecture.
Hello everyone, this is Vikram Prakash and you are listening to Architecture Talk. Each episode we try and have a conversation with a contemporary thinker to try and unpack what the broad logics of architecture and architectural thinking have been, are today, and what they might be in the future. All our conversations are actively interdisciplinary, and we try and advance the frontier of what architectural thinking could be by talking to people from many walks of life, from many different disciplines. Today I'm talking to University of Washington Film Studies Professor Sudhir Mahadevan, who has just written a book on the history of Bollywood, of Indian cinema, and its location in 19th and 20th century technologies, art forms, and social, cultural, and political contentions. I have a conversation with him about this history and in particular its relationship to the architecture of its production, which is to say the cinema house. I hope you enjoy it. Here we go. So welcome to Architecture Talk, Sudhir.
Thank you, Vikram.
I've been through your book, A Very Old Machine, The Many Origins of the Cinema in India, published I believe by SUNY Press in 2015. And I'm going to start asking you about the book soon. But it seems like it is it's a fascinating book, and I'm very interested in many things. We'll come to that. But before we get going, the moment I said we're going to be discussing Bollywood to my colleagues, everybody got really excited because, Bollywood has this huge cachet.
Yeah.
And I know this is not really the topic of your book.
Right.
But tell me, as a cinema studies scholar, why is cinema so big in India? What is it about it that captures such an imagination in the Indian social, cultural space of imagination or whatever else? Tell us why.
I wish there was one answer to that question. The more complex historical answer would be that, along with the print media, it was one of only two mass media forms that were shamelessly commercial in its orientation.
Is
in
that
the
it?
history of the
Because
subcontinent.
lots of money to be made. Is that
Lots
it?
of money to be made. It was one of two forms of popular communication that was not.
What was the other?
The print media.
Print media, you mean, like
Print media,
Illustrated
newspapers.
Weekly and all
Yeah,
that. Yeah, you talk about
newspapers.
Illustrated Weekly
Yeah.
in your book, yeah.
Because radio was government controlled.
I see.
Television came in very late.
So
If you situate it in the context of other media, you realize that cinema and newspapers have had a unique history in that they've always been free of top-down government intervention.
So thanks to the sort of strictures of the colonial administration and the Nehruvian, upper class, high art nation state, cinema offered a sort of carnivalesque space.
Exactly.
Low down, bottom up.
Yeah, exactly. And not that it didn't have to deal with government regulations, but it was always the sort of stepchild, right?
Okay.
And the government throughout tried to use it primarily as a source of taxation.
So people found it as a place for their frustrated desires and repression. That's a complicated answer.
That's a separate. So if the first one way to answer that question is to look at it institutionally in terms of institutional history and its relation to the state.
Right.
The other would be to ask what desires did it satisfy, or what fantasies did it fulfill. I'm not sure I have. There are many different perspectives. There's the ideology critiques that argue that this is it was a medium that was particularly adept at negotiating the tension between tradition and modernity. But in ways that were always deeply, some would argue, the Marxists would argue, deeply regressive.
Of course. And you have your strong Marxist bent throughout your book.
So Yeah, but you also have, there's also a history of sort of psychoanalysts taking up this question. Sudhir Kakar, for instance,
Yes, of course,
who
yes,
talked
yes.
about the cinema
Yeah.
and its relation to psychoanalysis.
Particularly
cultural
films like Diwar and, with the mother
Yes,
syndrome.
With the
and so-
mother syndrome. Wait, Did you know that Divar's English title is "I'll Die for Mama"?
Yes, I did know that. And, I have to tell you this story. I watched Diwar as a big fan.
Yes.
And when I came over here and I showed my wife, who's Italian American, Diwar, and she said, "Well, this whole thing is about mama." And I never really noticed that, which shows you how deep it is.
Yes, the IMDb title is "I'll Die for Mama." So if she's Italian American, she would probably get it.
Die for mama.
Yeah. So there's the other part of it, which is why is it popular? But I think in my book, I don't know if you want me to proceed to the book.
Sure.
I think one of the things that I'm saying is that to understand why the cinema became such a powerful cultural presence, you have to break it up into different objects and think of it in relation to different logics.
The
Different
many
domains.
origins. You mean the many origins?
The many origins.
Yes,
so
yes, in
if
your
you think of it in relation to technology, there's a particular history to be told about why it became so popular and so pervasive. If you think of it in relation to copyright law and a particular kind of legal archive, you realize that there's a way in which it gained cultural legitimacy, but a problematic cultural legitimacy.
Right.
And then if you ask why did it become a medium of topical relevance, why did it speak to people as something that speaks to their own present,
Yeah.
then you can relate it to the history of photojournalism and newspapers and
I
ask
see.
what made it topical.
Uh-huh.
So each of these logics allows us to think of what made the cinema so powerful in India.
Yeah.
In relation to technology, in relation to culture, in relation to topicality.
Yes, I see.
And you get different answers, right?
Right,
But they
right.
all in some ways point to the extraordinary power and presence of
So
the
it's like the
medium.
perfect storm is what
It's
you're
like-
arguing,
yeah.
like all these factors,
Yes.
along with this sort of, not subaltern, but sort of at least less than nation verificatory state.
Yeah.
Uh,
Except that the one modification that I would make there is that it wasn't a conjuncture, it wasn't a single moment where this
Correct.
this constellation
came
came
together.
together.
They're sort of
It's a
layered on
more
each other.
longer layered history.
Yeah.
Where different elements of it set in place at different moments.
Do you think this trajectory continues? Do you think with the neoliberal state and the present and the sort of, again, the digitization, the new
Yeah.
technology, you constantly talk about the people's responses to new technology
Yeah.
and the constant moaning about the past and the future. We'll come to Aura and all that, and
Yeah.
Halke and Pyasa and all
Yeah.
that. But is this layering continuing, do you think, today in Bollywood, or what's going on?
I think it is, and I think what's interesting for me is the way in which access to certain kinds of films has become easier.
Yeah, you
know,
found
there was-
videos of old like cinema and
Yes,
Yeah,
so
yeah,
there's
you
that
spoke about
kind
that.
of cultural memory that has always persisted.
Yeah.
The cinema as popular cultural memory.
Yeah.
But what I find interesting with the new platforms, with Amazon and Netflix, is
Yeah.
it's what I'm surprised by is how, even 10 years back, films, if you were a film festival person, you'd go to festivals and watch new films.
Right.
And you knew that you would never get a chance to see these films in the theater because they'd be produced by NFDC or something.
Yeah,
and
yeah,
they would,
yeah.
That's it.
That's it,
They would
yeah.
appear in festival theaters and that
Yeah.
Nandan in Calcutta or
Yeah,
so,
yeah.
or the complex in Delhi that would show the City Fort.
Chanakya City Fort,
Which used to be the film festival venue.
Yeah.
So you would get
City
these-
Auditorium.
City Auditorium. So you would get these venues where you would see these films, and then you would not get to see them again. But what I'm finding is that even films released 2 years back in festivals are now available on Amazon Prime and Netflix and Vimeo, and filmmakers are finding ways to make these films available.
So it's booming.
It's booming.
The
It's,
sort of diversity of
the
these-
diversity is really booming, and so then Bollywood is only one piece of the puzzle, right? That's only
And
one.
what are the other pieces of the puzzle?
Well, it's a regional cinema,
Regional
and,
cinema,
regional
and,
commercial
alternate
cinema, alternate cinema, in
documentary.
fact, documentary cinema, and there's also this question of whether regional art film even exists as a category. In some ways, the language has changed and people are calling it indie film.
Indie film,
You know,
right. Yeah,
so there's an obsolescence of terms,
Right.
terminology as well
Yeah.
as new platforms are emerging. You know,
Right,
people
right.
they don't want to think of themselves as regional art filmmakers. They think of themselves as indie filmmakers.
Okay.
And they're not bound in a kind of logic of region to nation
Right.
state anymore, because the new platforms have made that particular kind of geographical logic also obsolete.
Okay, well, that's great. I'm glad to hear that sort of cinema continues to thrive
Yeah,
in India and proliferate.
yeah.
But it seems to me in your book, rather than the narrative space, let's just say, or even the sort of idiomatic design space of cinema, you were much more interested in kind of the infrastructures and
Yeah.
technologies
Yeah,
and sociologies, if you want, of cinema,
Yeah.
right?
yeah,
And that's interesting. I mean, I'm following that argument, and I was really surprised by how often you talked about architecture, and how often sort of a description of a particular cinema house or sort of how people watched it was critical to you. So what is it? What is the relationship, as you see it, between the cinema house as architecture and the cinema, the movie? Why is this a critical relationship? I mean, I'm from a, let's just say, from a naive perspective, cinema, the film works when the cinema house disappears and everything becomes black.
yeah.
I mean, the architecture is expected to perform by its absolute absence.
By its absolute absence. That's the logic of the Hollywood film,
Right.
And that's the logic of Western perspectival, the proscenium theater,
Yeah.
where there's ordered seating, silence, immobility.
Right.
The screen is larger than life, and
Right.
the space of the audience disappears.
Right.
And the space of the screen takes over.
Yeah.
I think the part of that question that I answer in the book is that the infrastructural, what happened technologically and infrastructurally was that the space of the audience did not disappear because the technologies did not become obsolete. And so the traveling cinema show lasted in India much longer than it did in other parts of the world.
Right.
And so mobile cinemas, tent cinemas,
Yeah.
the bioscope wala,
Yeah.
all these people continued to operate, and there the lived space of the street became theatrical space on call,
Right.
in a kind of tokenistic transaction where you would give the guy a few paise and he would let you look through the bioscope,
Right,
and then
right,
he would
right.
run this projector of
Yeah.
scrap film.
Yeah.
And and you see this in there are references in many films
Yeah.
to this, right? So the infrastructural technological answer to that is that in India, the space within which movies are consumed, whether it's tent cinemas or the bioscope wala or slum cinemas in cities like Bombay,
yeah.
under bridges,
Yeah.
where migrant laborers from the south watch a combination of action films and softcore films.
Right.
These spaces haven't disappeared, and these spaces are not the classic space of the cinema hall where everything is turned down and you forget your space.
You're very aware of the presence.
You're very aware
of
of
your
the presence.
location, your community, your
Yeah,
friends.
Yeah.
There's
So
talking back to the cinema.
talking back to the cinema.
Yeah.
That's
It's like Italian cinema of old, also, as recorded in Cinema Paradiso.
true,
right? Yeah.
true. So it's a very communicative public sphere that's where the boundary between outside and inside is very porous, very fluid. Light comes in, and there's a technological answer for that. There's also a formal component to it. As a film studies scholar, I'm particularly interested these days in how the form of the typical masala film was influenced by the space of the
how's
hall. Because the single screen theater
Yeah.
had to accommodate anywhere from 500 to 2,000 people.
2000 on general, yeah.
And what that also meant is that it accommodated a diversity of people, families, single men in the stalls.
Yeah.
So
Lower stall,
it had
upper
a
stall.
lower stall, upper stall, balcony,
Balcony.
dress circle.
Yes.
All that stuff was happening. And so one argument that's been made by someone like Madhav Prasad that I actually still find somewhat persuasive is that the masala format of the Hindi film or of the Indian commercial film was in some ways a response to the
But that's generally argued as having to cater to the sort of lowest common denominator. Is that what?
right.
You mean?
That's I'm arguing, and Madhav Prasad actually says that it's not about the lowest common denominator. It's about the space of the hall. It's about the fact that all these different constituencies were accommodated in a single hall. This is not the multiplex theater.
Yeah.
So you had to appeal to a wide range of people who are in the same space. And so you had to find a form that would be viable, a cinematic form that would be commercially viable. So in some ways, then the space becomes absolutely central to the look of the film and the form of the film.
Give me your best example of this. Your classic example.
Any Amitabh Bachchan film.
Diwar,
Diwar
Sholay?
would be Diwar. Sholay would be a perfect example.
Okay, let's discuss Sholay. Tell me how this works.
So Sholay starts with the whole Western, train
Sergio Leone,
sequence. It then moves to there's this wonderful comic segments in the jail with Asrani as the Hitler-esque,
And Hema Malini.
and then
on the water tower.
On the water tower, अंग्रेजी इसको क्या कहते हैं? अंग्रेजी मरने जाते हैं तो suicide कहते हैं.
Suicide.
Suicide क्या होता है? The movie has a bit of melodrama, has a bit of action, has a bit of comedy, has a bit of spectacle, and it's appealing to all these different constituencies that are in the same hall. And it also has to be family friendly. It can't be
and have a moral message.
Yeah, it has
no
to have
transgressions really, no widow marriage really.
Yep. And as the Marxists would say, it reinstates the order.
Of course, patriarchy for sure.
Because Gabbar, you could read the film in a counter perspective with Gabbar Singh as someone who couldn't be incorporated into that existing order.
That's right.
Who's trying to break that, demolish that existing order. You could argue that about villains in many other films, Jagga and Avara, for instance.
That's right.
Who's been wronged.
Yeah.
And he's really been wronged.
Right. Well, that's the sort of image also taken up by the angry young man.
The angry young man, yes.
I mean, I did. A lot of youth of India, 70s, identified with that very strongly.
Yeah.
But in the end, he had to be, he had to die for Mama.
He has to die for Mama. Yeah. Also, the Sunil Dutt character in Mother India.
Yes,
the
of
younger
course.
son.
Yeah.
He's a revolutionary. He wants to break the social order.
So, are there more transgressive films coming out now?
I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah. Definitely. There's more queer films coming out. More strongly polemically feminist films coming out.
Right.
Films that are taking on the caste system in very direct ways. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
So when you talk of the space, the architectural space of the cinema, now you characterized it as a sociological space, which is to say a variety of people.
Mm-hmm.
But do you have any thoughts on and the porosity of the space with people coming in and out and in and out and in and out? So so what do you think is there going to be an impact of the multiplex on this?
Oh, the multiplex has already had its impact in
What is
very
the impact?
profound ways. The multiplex has transformed, has made viable a new kind of cinema in the last 10 years that would not have been possible before. I mean, the kind of cinema, what the multiplex has done is to make an intermediate form available that is neither commercial, entirely commercial, nor entirely art.
Right.
It has made it possible for filmmakers to take up serious subject matter, but to present them in a form for an audience largely upper middle class or upper middle class, largely urban, that wants something other than big budget Shah Rukh Khan Bollywood, but also doesn't want the old fashioned, profoundly slow paced art film of
Right.
Benegal and Nihalani.
Benegal and Nihalani.
Yeah, they want something intermediate, and that's what it's made possible. It's also actually made it's changed sound design, for instance. You know, Dolby and stereo has, because Indian films were always monoaural. You know, so the classic sound design of Indian films was essentially flat. It was not dimensional.
Right.
And the voice was always privileged over instrumentation. If you think of both dialogue and song, the vocal element was always privileged. That's changed.
Yeah.
You know, the style of the music that's presented has changed.
Right.
The dimensionality of sound has been integrated into the sound design of films, because filmmakers now realize they're dealing with really good stereo sound in a multiplex theater that's insulated, that's acoustically, perfect for dealing with.
So it's all good. I mean, it's a sort of cinema's advanced, but what about the fact that it has brought an end to this, to the sort of film that catered to the diversity of the audiences?
Yeah, I do think that there's something to be said about the loss of the old-fashioned social, which was the form that dealt with contemporary life, with an address that was expansive, addressed a sort of expansive, broad population. I feel it's increasingly difficult to find that.
So in your readings, both of that you present of Dada Saheb Phalke, and then later on with Guru Dutt in Pyasa, you start by recording them bemoaning the loss of the old, various ways, right?
Yeah.
Phalke saying, well, we used to have this great arts and paintings, and now all we have is this, and similarly in Pyasa, of course, the protagonist is talking about the commercialization of his poetry, and bemoaning that and walking off into the sunset as an anonymous poet.
Yeah.
But your point, as I read it in there, is but he's presenting this via cinema, which is exactly a modern technological art form.
Yeah.
Pace Walter Benjamin,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
So what is the exact argument you're saying? This is a contradiction. This is sort of the movement of the forces of modernity. What is it?
It's been a while since I revisited that chapter, so I'm going to have to remember my own argument there. But I think I think the point with both those chapters on both Pyasa, Phalke, copyright law, is that there is a central tussle between commerce and culture, between cultural legitimacy and commercial viability. Yeah. And what you find by the time you come to by the time you come to a film like Pyasa, is that the film is explicitly taking the side of of some idea of art as authentic, non-commercial, within a highly commercial medium. It's almost like the medium is trying to play this game of saying we're on the side of authenticity at precisely the moment when it is being sidelined by the state, by the Nehruvian state, and the Nehruvian state is not allocating money for the construction of theaters. It's seen as a bastard stepchild. It has already gone.
Fortunately, because then we get these massive, beautiful commercial theaters.
Yeah, you get exactly.
Although my father, who was in Chandigarh, architect in Chandigarh, he designed 3 of the biggest cinema houses in Chandigarh, right in the middle of the city.
Right.
So they have a sort of a state-controlled-ish look to them.
I see.
So there are 3 national cinemas, I have to tell you, nation-state cinemas in Chandigarh. Although they have now been destroyed and converted into multiplexes. But Neelam Cinema, Jagat Cinema, and KC Theatre in Chandigarh were made as part of the nation-state's expression. So just FYI.
Yeah.
But go on.
So I think the argument there was that Pyasa fails to recognize the emancipatory potential of commercial, mass-produced art, or it pretends to not to recognize it, even as it is itself a movie.
Right. So it's a sort of a modernist contradiction.
It's a modernist contradiction.
I mean, in a very much Adorno sense.
Yes, absolutely.
Correct?
Absolutely. absolutely.
Yeah.
It's a film that is that wears its contradiction.
Right, right.
In very explicit ways.
Yeah.
I don't. The Falke. I mean, there's a very complex history of copyright law that I was tracing from the 19th century producers of calendar art,
Right.
who were also arguing before the state that they were making, that they were producing art when in fact they were producing mass-produced calendar images. But their whole claim for to be protected by copyright law was that we're producing
Right.
art. And then from there I look at Falke. I don't remember exactly what my argument was, or I don't remember the exact trajectory that I traced. But again, with both the 19th century calendar image producers and with Falke, I argue that they're situated in this wider network of intellectual property regimes, piracy, that all these ideas of authenticity are being shaped through these within the matrix of commercial traffic, plagiarism, piracy. Falke is, in some ways, his early films, he's very much saying, I want these films to be shown to international audiences.
Right.
So even as he's seen as sort of the father of a kind of nationalist ethos, his own enterprise and his own perception of his enterprise, I argue, was shaped within a very transnational matrix.
So thinking about filmmakers, I was also very interested in your discussion of Krishna Shah.
Yeah.
This sort of maverick filmmaker.
Yes.
I mean, I never, to be honest, never heard of it. Of course, I saw Shalimar,
Yes.
and I thought it was a disaster.
It is a disaster.
Except for the music, which sort of somehow managed to persist,
Yes.
thanks to Rahul Da
Yeah.
and Ashaji's great voice.
And Usha Uthup.
And Usha Uthup, yes. So, but Mr. Krishna Shah seems like a distinguished fellow with multiple degrees and claims to
George
be
Lucas's
second to
classmate.
George Lucas
Yes.
and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
Though it's quite, it seems like you're not you're semi-sympathetic to the man. He's a bit of a carnivalesque fellow.
He's a carnivalist fellow.
And you zero in, at least in that chapter, on his second film. Second Bollywood attempt, Cinema, in which in particular you are fascinated by the idea that he turns the camera on the putative audience and shows the spectating agents doing stuff.
Yeah.
So tell us about Mr. Krishna Shah and why do you think he's interesting to you?
I discovered his. I think I started to do research into Krishna Shah mainly because of that film. And I think Film He Film, which I discussed two films, Cinema and Film He Film. And I don't remember which. Cinema is the one that involves sort of a documentary history of Indian cinema, but interspersed with images of the audience. Film He Film is the one that's found, that's essentially a compendium of footage from incomplete films. Right. That is then loosely strung together in this melodrama about this hapless producer who wants to make a film. Right. And Film He Film is not
very academic constructs, both of them.
Yeah, very academic construct. I don't think Film He Film was by Krishna Shah, but Cinema was by him. And it did play theatrically in the theaters, played in the theaters in Bombay. It was reviewed in the Times of India. I found the film, and what interested me about the film was this idea of film history as cultural memory and how you could construct a kind of, and I was really looking for non-traditional histories of the cinema narrated on film in India. I mean, how was historiography performed in the cinema, historiography of cinema performed in the cinema. And both of those films are exceptional. Then, of course, I found some Films Division documentaries about the history of cinema, some documentaries of biographies of Raj Kapoor and the like. So it's in that context that I started to research Krishna Shah, and it turned out that he was really trying to make crossover films
Yes.
before crossover
Yes, this
films.
was a big
You know,
disaster
he-
crossover
a
film.
disaster crossover film, and he made two versions, one without songs
Yeah.
for the Hollywood market
Yeah,
and
yeah.
one with songs. And
Yes, yes.
I'd be interested to do, didn't do research at the time, but it'd be interesting to look into whether the film got any reviews, played anywhere in the US.
Yeah, I'd be
you know.
interested in knowing. I
You know,
mean-
and Sylvia Miles was in that film, and Rex Harrison, if I remember correctly, is in that film.
Right. Rex
So
Harrison.
Rex Harrison is there, so he managed to get some people in.
Get some people in.
Yeah.
So let's talk about this business of cinematic history, intra-referencing.
Uh-huh.
I mean, there is this way to do it,
Uh-huh.
and then there's sort of the found footage way of doing it.
Uh-huh.
But there's the standard way, which is sort of like in Om Shanti Om.
Uh-huh.
There is sort of all these recreations of cinematic
Recreation, yeah,
history
yeah.
through a certain imagination. Yeah?
Yeah.
It's sort of a postmodern conceit, isn't
Yeah.
it?
Yeah.
To be self-conscious of your own history,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Why is this particularly of interest to you? Why is this interest in Bollywood cinema?
Because the challenge, I think, with Bollywood cinema is that if you have a cinema that's producing between 600 to 700 films a year,
Yeah,
the challenge for film historians and for archivists is where are all these films going? Who's going to save them?
yeah,
It's an archival challenge,
Sure,
and it's an
sure.
epistemological challenge too.
Yeah.
How do you cope with so many films being made? How
Yeah.
do you decide which ones can be preserved? Even today, archives, the major archives, they only make a fraction of their holdings even available for viewing because they don't have the funds to restore all the film
yeah,
cans
yeah.
that they have in their vaults.
yeah,
To make available to public. So you contact an archive sometimes and there's a film listed in their holdings and you say, do you have this film? Sometimes they'll deny it outright. They'll say, no, we don't have this film. It's in the list, but we don't have it.
yeah.
Right? Because they don't want if they
The
make
archive
everything
is too
available,
big.
it's too big, and there are only finite resources to make a film.
No, but
screen-
that's not solved by these by referencing, right? Or is it that problem?
by referencing what?
By intra-referencing in films.
No, so I'm getting to that point, which is that in India, the real standard lament is that the state archives don't know how to preserve films. They don't know how to preserve our cultural heritage. That they're doing a terrible job. They lose all these things in fires and so on and so forth. My argument in that book is that there's something to be said about cultural memory, about the way people remember songs, about the way in which iconography films circulate across generations,
Right.
And the way in which knowledge of film history gets embedded in the vernacular
I see.
as the vernacular essentially of
Yeah.
everyday life.
Yeah.
And that is also valid as a
Right.
kind of historical evidence
Right,
and as a
right.
form of history making
Right, right,
and
right,
history
right.
writing.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so that's where something like Om Shanti Om is just such a terrific and intelligent film.
Right.
Because it's taking up this idea of reincarnation.
Yes.
And it's
It's got
reincarnating a film that is about reincarnation.
Right.
So it's just such an
So many
extraordinarily
references.
intelligent.
I thought it was an amazing
It's
film.
one of the most amazing films I've seen in recent years, and it speaks in some ways to the ability of popular cinema to take up its own history and to recycle it repeatedly.
Right.
And it speaks in a larger way to what I call the obviation of obsolescence, right? That in India things don't become obsolete.
Never. Everything is always. Even Ram is still around.
It's still around. So when I start that book, I think somewhere I
So
say no
history doesn't
technology
exist.
dies a predictable death in
Yeah.
India, nor does it undergo an ordinary birth.
Right.
You know, and it's the same thing with cinema. Cinema doesn't die an ordinary death. Cultural memory finds ways to. I mean, I have talked in recent times to people who are actually trying to rescue films, commercial films, and trying to build an archive, and they say, well, but this is an academic argument that cultural memory will suffice. There really is a crisis.
I would also. There are both necessary.
Yeah, they're both unnecessary. That there is a real crisis of films being lost forever. Commercial films, hundreds and hundreds of commercial films that are just lost forever.
Right.
But there's something to be said about: is there a need to preserve every cultural expression?
Yeah.
And what?
I mean, that's
what,
also fetishistic.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, sort of
Yeah.
obsessive curatorial.
It's an obsessive curatorial.
Talking about obsessions, let me just ask you the simple question, like, what got you into cinema? I mean, why are you so obsessed with cinema, with Bollywood or Indian cinema?
My obsession with cinema really began with an obsession with technology. I was a technology buff. I was really interested in cameras and vintage cameras and
Oh,
how
okay.
images used to be produced. I mean, of course, I was a film buff
Yeah,
as an undergrad.
yeah.
I used to watch a lot of movies as an undergrad, but my intellectual interest in the cinema began not with films, but with the technology behind films.
What about it?
I was interested in how cameras functioned,
I
how
see.
were images produced in the 19th century, the whole idea of sort of
Celluloid.
manual exposure
Yeah.
cameras of daguerreotypes
Yeah,
and
yeah.
direct positive images
Yeah.
from the 1860s. And the tinkering with technology, with apparatus, was something that really fascinated me. And that.
Why? As you're engineering technology background? or
No,
is it
I have no
cultural thing?
idea. I don't know why. I mean, I think when I was a kid, I used to, my father would buy these airplanes and vans and ambulances, and I would take them all apart to see how they were put together.
So you should have become an engineer.
I had no interest in being an engineer, but I was interested as a historian, and for some reason, it's the historian in me that was interested in these things, not the engineer part of it. It's
Yeah.
not like I wanted to learn how to put them back together again. I wanted to take them apart and see how they were put together. you know, so that's where this project started. was
Did your
really-
dad buy you your first camera?
No. No, he
Who bought it for you?
let's see. I bought it myself.
Oh,
I bought a
really?
Polaroid
Oh, really?
Yeah.
So, like in school, high school?
in
you-
graduate school. Actually.
Grad school?
Yeah.
You had to
And
wait till
Polaroids were already sort of on their way out in the late 1990s.
Yeah, for sure.
So yeah.
Digital was taking over.
Yep. Yeah. So.
Did you feel like you were drawn to this more and more as digital became bigger and bigger?
No, I don't think so.
There's
I don't
no
think it
correlation.
there wasn't a sort of nostalgia.
Mm-hmm.
There wasn't any kind of retro nostalgia
So
that was
none-
driving me. No hipster inclinations.
No hipster.
It was just a love of a curiosity about technology and technological history. I was very interested in science and technology studies very early on in my graduate research. So I did a lot of reading in science and technology studies as well, just to understand the science and technology of cameras. And then, of course, I discovered very interesting things about photography in the Indian context, which led me to think about film as well. I mean, for instance, the daguerreotype was the direct positive images were around in India into the 1890s and early 20th century in bazaars,
Right.
when they'd gone obsolete in the United States and UK by the 1860s and 70s, you know.
Because
And-
of nothing dies in India.
But that's the more complex answer would be that the market was small,
Yeah.
which meant that mass production was not there. So no new technological innovation really flooded the market and pushed older technologies into obsolescence because the market was really small and fragmentary. So things could come in, were imported, and then they just stayed because there's like niche constituencies that sustained them,
I see.
you know.
Well, what do you think is the future of cinema, and the cinema house? That's what I'm interested in, as much as cinema.
Yeah.
Everybody predicted the end of the cinema house, even the multiplex,
Yeah.
a decade ago.
Yeah.
It hasn't quite
It
gone
hasn't
away.
gone away.
And Paul Allen's revival, for instance, of the Cinerama has been a smashing success.
Yeah.
So what do you think is the future of the cinema house?
Theatrical cinematic exhibition doesn't seem to be going away, is not going to go away anytime
Why not?
soon. That's my sense. I mean, it's a good question. I think it's a form of entertainment. It's a cultural ritual. People want to go to an auditorium and watch a movie on the big screen that you can't watch. That's an experience that's not going to be afforded for you on whatever handheld device you're watching it
projector.
on home projector. I mean, how many people use home projectors? They watch it on their laptops.
I mean, isn't that one of the contradictions that on the one hand, watching cinema is an isolating experience? Because, let's say a room gets pretty dark and then you sort of identify with the characters on screen and you sort of zoom in on them.
Yeah.
Yet at the same time, there is something about the sociality of it, right?
Yeah.
Even more than the Indian urban social space where there is, catcalling and so on.
Yeah.
What is it about?
Yeah, the sociality of the cinema hasn't gone away.
Yeah.
It's still central to the appeal of going to the movies.
Yeah.
And I'm reluctant to pose the question why, because then, or even try to answer the question, because I don't want to engage in sort of broad generalizations that this is a cultural ritual or that's ritualistic. There are paradigms within which you can answer that question, but I think a more complex question to look at the economics of it,
Right.
perhaps, and the industrial logics behind it that are
Right.
sustaining theatrical, commercial film exhibition. I don't think those industrial logics are going away anytime soon.
Right. Right. Well, I don't hesitate to make broad cultural generalizations without verifying.
So what do you think? So as an architecture historian, what do you think is the appeal of...
Well, I think it is, as you started to describe, the enduring power of the nexus between architecture and sociology. That it is not just about the brilliance of the film, that it is really about the construction of social space and social fabric, which requires architecture.
architecture.
Of some kind.
Yeah.
You require, a lobby, you require popcorn space, you require entry gates, you require, the hoarding outside, you require the sidewalk glance into the space, you require all these things, right? Besides the auditorium space with all its catcalling and sort of proximity to your loved one. The idea of going to the cinema with in America, as a date thing, for instance. All these, this is a sociality that requires architecture.
Yeah.
So just the cinema, which can be a beautiful film and probably better watched in isolation if you want to really critically engage with just the cinema, is not enough.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm happy to hang the coat on that hook of architecture and sociality, and which is also the reason why I think the small bookshop has not gone away. Everybody assumed Amazon would wipe out the small bookstore, but what it has done is wiped out Borders and Barnes and Noble and sort of the big
Chain
box,
bookstores.
chain bookstores. If not thriving, a lot of small bookstores are still alive everywhere.
Because you can't find out-of-print books
Out
in
of
the
print
newer...
book, or again, there's sort of a sociology to that.
Yeah.
I never went to Barnes and Noble to hang out.
Yeah.
I got my book out. Now that I can do on Amazon.
Yeah.
But I go to Elliott Bay bookstore for many reasons.
Yeah. To browse, to... Yeah.
Hang out, to sit, to use there. There are many reasons for it.
Yeah, there's a very interesting book that I read a couple of years back called In Broad Daylight by Gabriel Padula, and he actually takes up the space of the cinema hall as the object of his theorization. It's a small, elegant book. I would recommend it to you. I think it was published by Verso, and he argues that what the cinema hall does is to remind us that we are powerless to intervene in the darkness, the immobility, the silence is all meant to be a moral education, and he traces it back to the Renaissance, to theories of theater, going back to the Renaissance. And he says that it's about moral education, and the moral education is that you are powerless to intervene in the lives of the characters you're seeing on stage or on screen, but once you step out into the broad daylight, you can intervene. And so there's a very strong ethical lesson to be learned in the classic cinema theatrical space.
I see. So they are automatically divine, the people on screen,
Yeah.
and beyond your agency and reproach.
Yeah, and so you are helpless to intervene, and he says that that's lost with television or with other forms. In some ways, you're free to step in and step out. The image plays casually in your living room space, and that fundamental moral lesson,
Is
the
lost.
possibility of moral education, is lost.
I see. But that was never, impressed on the Indian audiences, I guess.
I don't know, yeah, maybe. But this brings me back to this question of the aura.
Yeah.
Because I was thinking about this when you were talking. The argument that's been made in the Indian context is that Benjamin's argument about the aura presumes a process of disenchantment. A move from religion to a disenchanted universe.
Yeah.
So the aura exists in a kind of sacred universe. It's also a universe that is without mechanical reproduction, and then mechanical reproduction and disenchantment in some ways destroy the aura. But in the Indian context, many scholars have noted that the aura is not destroyed but amplified by mechanical reproduction, whether you think of the pictures of gods and goddesses that are produced in the thousands, tens of thousands.
Yeah.
And that mechanical reproduction doesn't in fact destroy it.
Right.
And I think I was trying to make the argument in the book that is precisely the case as well in the South Asian cinema context. In the context of film, is that what a film like Pyasa shows is that as the poetry is published, the Gurudutt character thinks that it needs to be kept pristine and cannot be mass produced, that it has to be somehow protected from the market. Because mass reproduction would destroy it and destroy the sense of authenticity and pure art.
Right.
But in fact, what the film itself is unable to acknowledge in some ways, or it presents it as a negative thing when in fact it's not, is the paradox that his poetry sells like hotcakes.
Yes.
People love it.
Yeah.
The same audience that is presented by the film as this unthinking mob is also an audience that loves poetry and is willing to think of a poet as a god. And so what's interesting about that film for me is that it fails to recognize this redemptive potential of mechanical reproduction, that it can resuscitate the aura, that it can save art within the matrix of the market, that it can save cultural expression within the matrix of the market. Instead, it presents it as something negative that he has to abjure. And I argue that it's almost a kind of cultural amnesia, because if you look at the longer history, there was a time earlier where mechanical reproduction was seen as a good thing, was seen as something that would actually preserve the aura of objects. But by the time you come to the 1950s, you have this medium that is actually doing that. It's, it is sort of auratic in its power, and yet it wants to disavow its own auratic potential in the story of the poet who doesn't want his poetry to be published.
Right. I mean, one can read it. I mean, I see your reading of it as a disavowal, but one could also read it as a double bind, where it rigorously inhabits, without allowing cross-contamination, the contradiction of both auraticness and mechanical reproduction, because it is a double bind.
It's a double bind, yeah.
Yeah, and so you can sort of fudge it, or you can inhabit it, like you point out in the book, precisely by deriding exactly the medium that you are making.
Right.
So you sort of produce the contradiction rather than attempt to solve it, or privilege one side or the other.
Yeah.
But moving towards the end, let's move towards the end of your book. You got a little postscript over there.
Yes.
And you discuss this, what is it called, sort of Bollywood museum.
That's right.
Museum project. Apparently, I looked it up online. Looks like they still haven't quite made it, or whatever.
No, I have that issue of I don't remember what the magazine was.
Architectural Indian Architect and Builder.
Indian Architect and
apparently
Builder.
Published a project by some LA firm.
Yeah.
Your standard international, global, modern, Hollywoodized museum project with curvy walls and sort of let's get some money out of you.
Yeah.
But so this Bollywood museum, I didn't think you liked it.
Right.
You thought it focused too much on the ephemerality and saleability of the Bollywood image and the sort of stardom of the superstars and
Yeah.
so on. And by contrast, you end up by describing your experience of walking up this dark corridor, like in a movie hall, then fumbling through to find your seat and opening, in this case, cupboards, and sitting in there and discovering the wonders of the cinematic experience. So, and these posters, etc., you found in Old Delhi.
Yeah.
Is it a bit nostalgic? What is the sort of crux of this postscript? What is it about that darkness of that space and that bodily experience, which I completely share with you?
Yeah.
And I share with you in sort of a semi-traumatic manner. Because I remember one of the first films I ever saw was Hare Rama, Hare Krishna in 1971 or whatever it was. And, I was 7, 8 years old, and I went with my sisters and my mom, and they lost me. They forgot my hand. So there were, traumatic minutes where I was lost with Hare Rama, Hare Krishna, blaring in Neelam Theatre, in the modernist Neelam Theatre in Chandigarh. But nevertheless, that sort of disorientation,
Right.
which is, I would call, the denial of architecture.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
Which is
Absolutely.
necessary for the production of cinematic
Yes.
space,
Yeah.
is exactly the experience you valorize in the postscript versus the sort of open source social space of the watching cinema space. So I want you to comment on that.
But what's crucial there is what I discover at the end.
Okay.
You go through all of that stuff, and then you find, as if it's a cinema has been turned inside out, and you're finding all the materials that comprise the cinema.
Yeah.
And so for me, that was what was exciting about that whole experience, is that it was like going through that space and then not sitting and being consumed by this larger than life image, but instead to go behind that larger than life image and to see all of the innards, the viscera behind the construction. For me, as in some ways a media archaeologist, as a cultural historian, that is what's so exciting about that whole experience, was that I felt like I was walking through a movie theater, and then I open, and then there's this door filled with movie posters, and it's a rusted old door with aluminum things, but it's got all these movie posters, and you open it and you get this bright sunlight.
Right.
And then he opens up the thing, and there are all these like movie posters of B movies. So it was really the insides of the cinema, the materiality, the tactility.
You're interested in the technology, and you want to bring apart.
Yeah, I wanted to take it apart.
Take it apart.
Yeah.
So if you were the director of this new Bollywood museum, and you were commissioning me as the architect to design this, to get ready to design.
Yeah.
So what's the concept statement that you will give me for the Sudhir Mahadevan Bollywood Museum in Goregaon?
Tactility, perhaps I would give you some words. Tactility, materiality, infrastructure, cultural memory, not holograms,
no holograms,
no holograms, no smooth surfaces, something that that really integrates the cinema back into its lived context.
Wonderful.
Lived ambient context.
Well, we'll try and design that for you. Thank you for being on Architecture Talk.
Of course. Thank you for having me on, Vikram. It was a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to Architecture Talk. This is Vikram Prakash, your host, and our producer is the one and only Sammy Prouty, a graduate student of architecture here at the University of Washington in Seattle. I hope you all enjoyed our conversation, and if you did, please do take a moment to subscribe and to rate us on iTunes. See you next time. Take care. Goodbye.